Hello and welcome to In Depth with TommieMedia. I'm Emily Haugen. A new voice is guiding St. Thomas students through the rapidly evolving field of strategic communication, which includes advertising and public relations. April Eichmeier joined the St. Thomas faculty in August as a professor and TommieMedia advisor. Eichmeier, who recently graduated with a PhD in mass communication, brings a fresh perspective and professional experience to the classroom. Today, we will discuss her perspective on and approach to teaching strategic communication. Professor Eichmeier, thank you for joining us. So, you just recently graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with your PhD in mass communication. What led you as an educator to choose St. Thomas?
I wanted to work at St. Thomas for a couple of reasons. Number one, having grown up in Northwest Iowa, I was familiar with the school and familiar with its excellent reputation. I think another important factor behind my decision was that strategic communication is such a dynamic area, as you mentioned in your introduction. And so it's really fun to teach, and I think an important skill that students should have. And I was happy, and I'm really happy to be here.
So strategic communication is more important than ever in today's changing world, which you kind of just touched on.
Sure.
What is the most important thing for your students to know as they prepare for a career?
That is a difficult question because it really depends on context. But in terms of important lessons, if I had to choose one, and that is very hard, I would say that audience centrality is the key to strategic communication. I've worked with a lot of experienced, over the years, worked with a lot of experienced strategic communication professionals, and the best ones always kept the audience in mind. And I think when people get into their workplaces, it's really easy to get caught up in what you're doing. And so learning about the audience and always keeping the audience as the center, I think is the most important skill we can teach. I would also say, though, related to that are the way we think about audiences and the way we write for audiences, those two really go hand in hand. So it's one thing to know about the audience, and it's another thing to learn how to write for them or how to communicate with them effectively. For example, in my training at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we talked about how people interpret and understand risk. For example, risk from the flu or risk from COVID, or not so much risk from COVID because I had gone by then. But risk from the flu, for example, people don't understand quantitative information sometimes as much as they might understand other kinds of information. And so I'm really concentrating on on effective communication when we think about the audience, but also how we write. And that was a pretty long answer. Any more questions on that?
Oh, nothing wrong with the long answer. So you have both a PhD and significant experience in the strategic communication world. You talked about how you worked with a lot of different professionals. And of course, you're now bringing that to St. Thomas. So what makes that combination so important for your students?
The combination of the practical experience and the theory is because I think that they really work well together. For example, I was teaching the other day about a communication and persuasion model called the Elaboration likelihood model. And it is a well-used theory in communication scholarship. But I was able to talk with the students about how this scholarship and about this theory helps us understand how people understand information and how to better communicate this information. For example, one of the tenets of the Elaboration likelihood model is that to make an attitude change and to affect attitude change on a more permanent basis, a longer-term attitude, it takes elaboration, which is the way which essentially elaboration is the extent to which individuals think about an argument that they've made. And so if you're approaching a strategic communication and you want to enact long-lasting attitude change, you have to think about your arguments, for example, and you have to give people a reason to want to engage with your argument. Motivation, of course, is one of the key factors in the elaboration likelihood model. And so we were talking in class about, for example, how when you're running through the world as a strategic or as just a citizen, how many communications you see. Something has to make you stop and think for a little bit before attitudes will change. Now, in the practical side, we know that happens as well. We know that people have to think about something a lot of times before they will change their mind, or before they will, for example, buy a product, especially if there's a high amount of dollars involved, or especially if they're making choices between one or two if they have to. And so when I'm talking about theory, I bring in the practical experiences that I have to show the relevance. And I think that when students go out into their jobs, even if they're not speaking up in meetings about, well, I learned in the elaboration likelihood model, which would actually be quite funny because in all my years, no one ever brought up a communication theory when I was in a meeting. I think that even if they're not bringing it up, which might sound odd to the ears of their colleagues, they can be thinking about, well, what kind of situation am I in? What kind of thinking is my audience going to do about what I'm asking them to do or promoting? And so I really think that they talk to one another and that the students benefit from that.
That's incredibly valuable. So as we've discussed throughout the show today, the world of strategic communication is ever changing. So as this field continues to evolve, what vision do you have for classes that could keep your students up to speed?
I'm really happy to talk about that because I could talk about that all day, actually, because there's plenty of courses we could do. One course, though, that I think in particular that students would benefit from is a risk communication class. I took a similar course at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from one of the leading scholars in risk communication. Her name is Dominique Brossard. She was on my PhD committee, and I was lucky enough to have her. But I think as the world, as science in particular, and gets more uncertain, but there's uncertainty in other areas that aren't science, of course. But when you think about the complexity of something like modern science, we're not going to have all the answers right away. And there's always a balance between how do we properly communicate risks about technologies such as human genome editing, which is a subject I covered in my dissertation. How do we talk about that while maintaining the balance between risks we need to anticipate versus risks that are very low, but yet that scare people? And that is an acquired skill. And there's a lot of thought that goes into how we communicate. If you think about the bad examples of risk communication when people get overly worried, for example, the CDC was heavily criticized during the Ebola outbreak that they didn't communicate and weren't straightforward and perhaps elevated some risk perception that didn't need to happen. So I would love to develop a course here on risk communication because there's so much to talk about. And I think it also covers well into persuasive context. So for example, perhaps a more pedestrian attitude is thinking about hand washing, right? There's a risk in not washing your hands after, in the instances that you should, right? And that's, it's not, it's a topic I think that it helps something like hand washing and thinking about the risk of hand washing, it's a persuasive situation. And so thinking about risk communication and health behaviors like that, for example, I think it would really complement our other courses.
I hope that you'll get a chance to implement that in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today. If there's a topic that you would like covered on in-depth, tweet us at TommieMedia. With April Eichmeier, I'm Emily Haugen. We'll see you next time we go in depth on TommieMedia.